For decades, the Zionist regime sold itself as West Asia's lone island of safety. A place where a Jewish immigrant could step off a plane at Ben Gurion Airport and immediately feel the quiet confidence that the regime's billion-dollar missile shields had their back. That image of safety was one of the most important factors drawing immigrant Jews to the occupied Palestinian territories. A diverse society whose members, apart from occupation, shared little in common. The result of decades of occupation was a devastating blow dealt to the regime at dawn on October 7, 2023. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood by the Palestinian Resistance. Palestinian fighters launched a full-scale assault by land, air and sea against the Zionist regime's military positions. Suddenly, the idea that every fence was unbreachable evaporated. From that moment, the Zionist regime did everything it could to revive its image of deterrence. Months later, and following a series of regional developments, the Zionist regime, desperate to regain its lost prestige, launched a 12-day war against Iran. The regime tried to present itself as victorious, but in those 12 nights, social media became filled with videos of Israelis sprinting for shelter as sirens howled over Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Beersheba. The question now is this: in that 12-day war, what happened to the Zionist regime and to the image it was trying to build?
Wow!
To understand why that secure brand mattered so much, you have to rewind to the regime's demographic DNA. This is, by design, a regime comprising newcomers. Unlike indigenous Palestinians who can trace ancestors to a village graveyard, Zionist settlers came to this land after World War II with the promise of security and seized Palestinian homes by force. Embedded within that migration was a reality that could become the regime's greatest nightmare. As David Ben Gurion, the founder of the Zionist regime, says, security for the regime is a matter of survival and annihilation. If conditions become dangerous, the ground is laid for reverse migration of settlers, a trend whose signs have been visible since the Al-Aqsa flood and the 12-day war. With the close of the Hebrew year in 2025, statistics tell a clear story of reverse migration from the occupied territories. About 79,000 settlers left the occupied territories. Taking into consideration immigration into the occupied territories, the regime's overall population fell by 28,000, a slow, quiet tide that doesn't look like war, but just as surely decides a regime's fate. Reverse migration can destroy the Zionist regime from within. That's why, from the very beginning, keeping the occupied lands safe became an existential issue for the regime.
امروز قدرت بازدارندگی رژیم صهیونیستی به پایان رسید. همون چیزی که سالها پیش، دهها سال پیش بن گوریون هشدار داد. شاید حدود 60 سال قبل از این یکی از مؤسسین اصلی رژیم صهیونیستی و نخست وزیر این رژیم بود. اون گفتش که هر وقتی قدرت بازدارندگی ما به پایان برسه رژیم ما مضمحل خواهد شد.
Thus, from day one, the project for the regime was to sell itself as a safe island, and then build the muscle to make that story believable. That's why the military build-up wasn't an afterthought. It was the agenda. Even in its deals with the United States of America, you see it spelled out as qualitative military edge. Basically a guarantee that this army must stay a step ahead of every other military in West Asia all the time. From an economic perspective, ambitious schemes such as the India-West Asia-Europe Economic Corridor or IMEC, were floated, casting the regime as the region's economic hub. Or with USA backing in 2020, the Abraham Accords were unveiled to normalize relations with Arab states and claim regional political centrality. The Zionist regime sought to fix this narrative in place. Invest here because no security problem is too big for the regime to handle. But in October 2023, the grand plan they had worked on for years fell apart. Investments halted. Maritime insurers raised premiums for shipments destined for the occupied territories. This meant the regime's long-term planning had been upended. In politics too, normalization stalled. Some countries that had normalized ties reconsidered their relations with the regime. So the Zionist regime pursued a single objective: rebuild deterrence at any cost. It launched an unprecedented aggression against Gaza, declaring its goals to be the release of captives and the destruction of Hamas. 2 years have passed since then. Over 61,000 Palestinians, including 20,000 children, were killed by the Zionist regime. Alongside bombs, the regime used hunger as a weapon. Yet, despite all these crimes, it did not achieve its objectives. The regime believed that if it assassinated commanders and leaders, the resistance would collapse. But this did not happen, neither in Lebanon nor in Gaza. After these assassinations, and also after the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in late 2024, the Zionist regime placed an even bigger bet. This time, an attack on Iran. Repeating the same scenario. On June 13, 2025, it assassinated a number of Iranian military commanders and nuclear scientists with the aim of bringing Iran to its knees. The regime pursued the following goals in Iran: to destroy Iran's defensive capabilities so that Iran could not target the occupied territories, to incite the Iranian people to revolt against the state, to achieve, in Washington's words, a normalization of Iran's regional behavior, and at one point they even hoped for regime change in Iran. But this pleasant dream for the regime did not last even one day. Under the command of Imam Khamenei as commander-in-chief, within just a few hours, the martyred commanders were replaced, and in less than 24 hours, Iran's retaliation began. Waves of Iranian missiles, bypassing the regime's multi-layered air defenses, struck the regime's strategic targets with precision, one after another. In one example, the Weizmann Institute, a highly sensitive center of the regime where the results of decades of research were stored, was completely destroyed by Iran's extremely powerful missiles. Iran's strikes hit so hard that by June 22nd, even the regime's strongest backer, the United States of America, stepped in, bombing Iranian nuclear facilities. But that still didn't stop the counterattacks raining down. The regime's bet that Iran would splinter from within turned out to be a total miscalculation. Instead, the opposite happened. Faced with foreign aggression, Iranians closed ranks. Differences set aside overnight, Iranians rallied behind the Islamic system. For the Zionist regime, it was a brutal reminder. Their calculations were not just off, they were upside down. On the other side, the story looked very different. Iran's missiles didn't just crater concrete. They punctured a myth, each strike chipping away at the regime's safe island brand.
مجازاتی که ملت ایران و نیروهای مسلح ما برای این دشمن خبیث انجام دادن و دارن انجام میدن و برای آینده برنامه دارن مجازات سختی است و او رو دچار ضعف کرده. همینی هم که دوستان آمریکاییش وارد صحنه میشن و حرف میزنن نشانه ضعف و نشانه ناتوانی اوست.
And it wasn't just that Zionists felt unprotected during those 12 days. That was one failure. The larger humiliation was that the regime fell under international isolation.
Please, order in the hall. Please, order in the hall. Please, order in the hall. Please, order in the hall, and please be seated. Please, order in the hall.
Images of Gazan children dying from famine and hunger spread among Western societies, circulating from person to person, and ignited a wave of anger and hatred against the Zionist regime across the world. The pro-Palestine demonstrations that had been held since the start of the Gaza genocide took on a new character. This time, it wasn't only about Palestine. All Western human rights claims were called into question by their support for the Zionist regime. With this trend, Western statesmen faced a choice: either join the people with the slogan of immediate ceasefire, or continue their support for the regime at the cost of losing public opinion. In the wake of unprecedented public pressure, and after 2 years of ruthless killings of Palestinian civilians, while the Zionist regime, despite all its military might, intelligence apparatus, and siege, failed to eliminate Hamas, the regime and its chief backer, the USA, reached a point where the costs of continuing the war outweighed any claimed gains. Internal fractures, a crisis of legitimacy abroad, and moral and political isolation worldwide. Million-strong protests, rifts within Western parliaments, and searing images of famine tied the hands of the war's backers and forced them to accept the reality on the ground and the resilience of the resistance. And so, in October 2025, stepping back from their present goals, they signed a peace agreement with representatives of the Palestinian resistance. An agreement that may have stopped the fighting, but didn't change the truth. As long as occupation endures, resistance will endure. The story of the Zionist regime's grand gamble in attacking Iran began decades earlier, with migration and occupation. Zionist migration to the occupied territories took place under the promise of security. But that occupation led to the formation of a resistance front, a front founded on a set of ideas that bombs and missiles cannot erase. On the contrary, it grows stronger.
تحلیل من از سفر رئیس جمهور آمریکا به داخل فلسطین اشغالی به این کارهایی که کرد و این حرفایی که زد اینه. اینا مایوسن. اینا در جنگ 12 روزه اونچنان سیلی خوردن که باور نمی کردن، توقعشو نداشتن، مایوس شدن. این رفت روحیه بده به اونها توقع نداشتن که موشک ایرانی ساخت دست جوان ایرانی بتوانه با شعله های خودش